Hi, my name is Rosalie Harden, and I'm the executive producer of Faith and Finance. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation this afternoon about the intersection of money and meaning. As many of you know, I was one of the founders of SOCAP, the Global Conference on Impact Investing and Social Entrepreneurship. The moniker for that event is the intersection at the Conference of Money and Meaning. One of the things we used to remember, still remember about that event was a time when Gary Bowles, who was one of our co-founders, said to me, you know, Rosalie, I'm counting on you to keep us honest about the meaning side. Because I know, Gary said, if we don't stay focused on meaning, money will take over. And every year at SOCAP, we would struggle with that. How did we keep meaning at the table, especially, it turned out, when the idea that investing in businesses that actually were doing good were really making money, and maybe more money than if the investments had made otherwise. So money just kept demanding people's attention. So after SOCAP 19, last fall, a bunch of us got together to talk about how we as people of faith might be able to do a better job of framing meaning if we were more intentional about using the faith lens in that framing. And that brings us to the conversation we're having today. SOCAP starts on Monday. It's going to be very different, all virtual, but has some really great content. I hope that many of you will be joining SOCAP and that this conversation will help your conversations there too. I'm really disappointed that our friend Bonnie Molenbrook ended up with a conflict and was not able to join us today, because I was expecting at this moment to turn my camera off and sit back and listen. But after we did our prep call a few days ago, I got so excited about the conversation. It was so rich. I'm really looking forward now to being a part of it. Not exactly sure when I first met our moderator today, Mark Elliston, but I can tell you this, at last March at an event about Christian entrepreneurship, he was one of the speakers. His topic was impact investing, and I thought to myself, okay, I've been to at least 50 impact investing conferences. What is this Presbyterian pastor and college minister going to say about impact investing that I haven't heard already? And as it turned out, he had quite a bit to say, very much so about the role of faith and church and money. His book, which will be released by Erdman's, is that right, Mark? In a few months, We're Not Broke, is equally compelling. I'm really happy to have him here today to guide this conversation. So Mark, I'm gonna shut up and let you take over.
Thank you, Rosalie. Great to be here with everyone. I feel honored to have this chance to sort of moderate this conversation. We had a great discussion earlier this week with this team, and I'm really looking forward to continuing that together. So Rosalie, we did actually meet at SOCAP, I believe, a couple of years ago, so that is appropriate. As Rosalie said, I am a Presbyterian minister. I also have an MBA and live sort of at this intersection of money and meaning in my work as both a pastor and as a social entrepreneur. I wear two hats in my work life. I'm the executive director at the Presbyterian Campus Ministry Center at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I'm a co-founder of Rooted Good, an organization that serves social entrepreneurs and congregations with tools and resources for doing more good in the world. SOCAP has actually been quite influential for me. The book that Rosalie mentioned that is coming out in the spring is a direct result of SOCAP in many ways for me, turning some of the work that I did into a deeper understanding around impact investing and assets and the use of assets in the church. All the people on this panel, actually, I've connected to somehow or another through that, which is great. So today we want to really just talk a bit about how the perspective of faith, and for full disclosure, this panel is a really Christian-centered set of people. Obviously, the conversation goes beyond the Christian faith for sure. But how does faith inform the way we deal with investing and money and our resources, both sort of as institutions, as also as individuals and as people in the world? So my assumption going into this is money is always about more than money. And so money carries with it much deeper values and moral questions, ethical questions that are much deeper than simply just transactions with money. So I want to start by inviting each of our panelists to say a little bit about who they are and just kind of get into it that way. I'm going to start with Derek Morgan. I actually met Derek last year at SOCAP, so probably almost exactly a year ago, outside the tent on a nice October day in San Francisco, and now we're doing this over Zoom. But I want to ask Derek if you would introduce yourself a little bit, who you are, what it is that you care about and are sort of engaged in your work, and then if you could say one thing about how your faith informs your relationship with money, that would be a great way to get started.
Thank you, Mark. Glad to be here. Glad I could join this conversation. My name is Derek Morgan. I'm the managing partner of Kingdom Group, which was launched about a year or so ago, simultaneously on the same day as retiring from a 9-year NFL career with the Tennessee Titans. So spent my whole career with the Titans, currently live in Nashville, and really have been in the impact investing space, I would say probably for the last 3 to 4 years. It really came out of a desire really to align my values and with my capital. And that desire comes from my faith, which governs and dictates my decision-making. And so that is the guiding light of my life. And, integrity and authenticity is a very big components of my life. And I like to be authentic to, what I say I'm going to do and match it up with my values. And so that's really been my guiding force. And what we do currently is social impactful real estate projects, as well as investing in, directly into companies. And so that's my day to day. And I'm excited to be a part of this conversation.
Great. Fantastic. Todd, could you jump in and do the same stuff and tell us about your interests?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do it. I'm Todd Johnson. I'm the founder and CEO of an impact transparency platform known as IPAR. I started doing that about 4 years ago after nearly 30 years of being a lawyer. One of the advantages of getting old is you get to look at long arcs and trajectories. And I've been privileged to be working with social entrepreneurs and impact investors for almost 20 years now, which is how Rosalie and I met probably almost 15 years ago, when Rosalie and Kevin and others were working on Good Capital. And I think from my perspective, the transition from helping other people as an advisor and consultant to actually doing came out of a frustration that the impact space was attracting more capital, but people were still reliant on the storytelling vis-a-vis impact. And there's nothing wrong with stories. I like to say that data without stories, I like to say that data without stories are soulless, but stories without data are useless. And so the mission of IPAR is to try to bring data analytics to the question of what is impact, where are we having it, how do we know how much we're having it? And really my faith informs all of this, because one of the foundational questions that I had to confront was if I was going to be serious about this space, I had to answer the question, what is good and how do I know it? And I think for every impact investor, that's a foundational question. And for people of faith, that's not so hard, but it takes you to being able to, number one, acknowledge it's not about me, and number two, acknowledging that the money's not mine. So that's a little bit about my journey and why I'm involved and passionate about it.
Great, thanks. Glad you could be with us. Reggie, it's good to have you here. Tell us a bit about, you're the resident theologian here on the call, so tell us a little bit about that.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. I'm Reggie Blunt. I'm on the faculty of Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, and I teach and research in the area of practical theology. My work covers doing how do we engage in ministry with youth and young adults, but it's also has broadened into how do we engage in better leadership, congregational development as well. I lead a cohort of doctoral ministry students. I'm serving as their advisor around the theme of strategic leadership for Black churches. And that has kind of led me into this whole conversation around language as far as how do we help congregations, particularly those who are serving in under-resourced communities, begin to be at this table. Churches have always engaged in community engagement. They've done outreach ministry, but they don't know the language of social impact and not recognizing that it's synonymous and has not been in these conversations. And so I'm working to help congregations begin to be exposed to this work. I'm the recent co-founder of a nonprofit called the Oikos Institute for Social Impact, where we're working toward creating supportive ecosystems for faith communities who are serving in under-resourced communities to be able to be in partnership with those who are also wanting to engage in social impact to help transform our communities. And I think you asked the question around my relationship of how does my faith affect my relationship with money? And when you posed that question to me, it caused me to pause. And it made me realize that my values is really rooted in theological understanding of stewardship. That the whole notion of how I understand money and how I work with money is recognizing my faith commitment that what I have is not what I own, but what has been entrusted to me. And so that's what leads and guides me and structures all that I do in that arena. Again, great to be here.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that stewardship thing. That's really, really, really important. So Rosalie, you are now running an organization that's called Faith and Finance. So tell why is it called that? Why are you doing this work? And in what way does your faith inform your relationship with finance?
I was a parish priest in the Episcopal Church for a dozen years. And one of the things I learned preaching just about every Sunday was that what we preached about was, we didn't preach about issues in our congregations because people in the pews needed to hear it. And we always preached about what we needed to hear. And I was always surprised at that when it happened over and over and over to me in the pulpit. And I think one of the reasons this faith and finance thing has been such an important thing for me to just keep following through was that I need it. My relationship with money is really messed up. I worry about it. I don't feel like I have enough of it. I am selfish. You can just go right down the list of all the things that I know are problematic. And the last few months, as we've dug in deeper with faith and finance and had the opportunity to be in conversation with some theologians about money, with Eve Blossom and Jed Emerson, and more a philosopher than a theologian, but a pretty good theologian too. And then Willie James Jennings, I started saying, oh my gosh, I think I may have done this because I needed it. And that's probably the most important piece of why it stuck. But the other thing was that back in 2005 or so, when Todd was talking about Kevin and Tim Freundlich were starting Good Capital, well, before they even started Good Capital, they would be going to the Social Enterprise Forum and attending all these things. And Kevin would come home and tell me about it. And as I first started hearing about this, I was a parish priest, And I was really confused about why are all these Silicon Valley types honing in on this, and why isn't the church talking about it? Why hasn't the church been talking about what we do with our money and how we invest and how we spend, and how the separation between rich and poor, the wealth gap, and causes us to not be building the reign of God here on earth. And I just kept feeling like that the church needed to get in this conversation. But while I was producing SOCAP, I would try to remember every year to bring a group of church folks to SOCAP, and we would have great conversations there. And one of the things that really stood out for me was we had a breakfast group right in the middle of Festival Hall where there were, 1,000 people in there eating, and there were 40 pastors from the Bay Area there. And Ross Baird was talking to the group he was screaming at the group because it was the only way you could get through to be heard. And after he talked about what he was doing with Village Capital, and he introduced a couple of entrepreneurs that were there as a part of SOCAP. One of the pastors from Walnut Creek, I don't remember who it was, but I remember that it was a pastor from Walnut Creek, stood up and said, on Sunday mornings, I'm gathering a few Christians together to talk about their faith. The people in this hall are building the kingdom of God. They're coming up with solutions to real-time problems that Jesus would have us look at. And so that just has stuck with me over and over. So, how do we build a more equitable and just and fair society, and get out of this hoarding my money?
That's great. Yeah. That leads me to, I've got a question for Derek I want to ask, but just real quickly, if people have questions, people listening in, participating in this, have questions, put them in the Q&A. Feel free to do that as we go. We'll have a little bit of time at the end specifically on that, but if you've got them as they come up, just put them in the Q&A, and then we'll have them there. So I was going to ask, just piggybacking off where Rosalie was there. So Derek, you do this work. I mean, you actually do this work on the ground, investing, making choices. Can you tell us an example or two of where you have chosen to get involved in a project because of so the underlying kind of purpose of that project and how it aligns with your values, or vice versa, where you've chosen to avoid not get involved in a project for that reason? That'd be interesting to hear.
Yeah, I see way more projects that don't align with my values. Not that they're inherently bad projects, but they just don't fit within my personal thesis of things in which I want to, allot my time to. I have a blessing of having had a career where, I don't have to make decisions out of a scarcity mindset or just kind of to make the numbers work. So it allows me to be much more disciplined and selective on the types of projects in which, I lean into. So the first project that always kind of, stands out for me is in my hometown. And, it's a small steel city, town really, outside of Pennsylvania, called Coatesville. And not a lot of resources there, not a lot of opportunities. It actually sits within the richest county in Pennsylvania. But a lot of those resources don't trickle down to the city itself. And so that was the first place where we started looking at trying to, make an impact in a positive way. And so through, really, and it's funny because at the time we're like, hey, we're going to, raise some money. We're going to do, invest into, maybe some buildings, repurpose or blah, 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 blah. But when you really get back there, you realize that the city's very much so landlocked and there's not a lot of, repurposing opportunities. So there was one piece of land that was available that we, started to look at to say, okay, here's an opportunity. We can go ground up construction, put something that's very in touch with the residents of the city, and it meets the demands of the city in terms of like what the needs are. And so we started, down this journey really of like, I would call it bottom up, and talking to residents, talking to churches, talking to nonprofits, city officials, all the way up to like, even the governor. Our project was in front of the governor. And so like, it's really this full spectrum of conversations that we've been having, where really a lot of times, in these areas don't necessarily happen and take place because you have people that are just disconnected. You have somebody in the tax bracket up here, doesn't always have a seat, doesn't sit at the same table as somebody with a tax bracket down here. It's just the reality of it. And so like that for me, in terms of like wanting to go back to where I came from and realizing that if it wasn't for football, I don't necessarily know what my options would have looked like. I always got good grades, and, that was credit to my mom, but like, there wasn't a lot of like money available for college. So for me, it was like, okay, I made it, but what about, my hundreds of people that I went to school with who were athletes or whoever, my best friends who were right alongside on the football team with me, that they didn't make it past high school. What were their opportunities? And so I felt that being that I made it to the league and played a longer career, it's like, all right, I got a platform, I got to use it for the good of others. It's not just me, and what I could accumulate. No, it's about giving back. I've been blessed with resources, so those resources have to flow through me, and so that's really, the first project in which we started. We're still early on. It's been a journey, to say the least. There are other projects out here in Nashville that we're, partnering with the housing authority to do affordable housing. But, all in all, I will say that it is easier, it does make it easier to be very selective when you have a sort of values that are guiding you. And so that's been my experience thus far.
It sounds like that it's harder too in a way, somewhat though, right? Because you're looking not only to judge a project based on its, financial performance, but also on its impact in the community in a deep way, which means finding out what the community needs, getting stakeholders involved, like you said, that wouldn't normally be at the table. Not just sort of doing a project because you can do a project, right? But doing a project more intentionally. It's not easy, I imagine, to layer all of that on top of just the regular aspects of development, which have their own complications associated with it.
Yeah, it's challenging for sure. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, I was just going to interject, Derek. I'm just so taken by your other-centricness. Your focus on other people and how you use your resources. And maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I just have a false impression, but what it leads me to ask is, your colleagues in the NFL, was that a pervasive sort of attitude about their money? Or, what Rosalie was talking about, I have to confess that my inclination is often to worry about money, to hoard money, to think about how to make more money out of a fear that I'm not going to have enough money. And my sense is that your attitude might be an exception rather than the rule.
Yeah. What I've noticed is most of my peers that I play with, they've all had a very similar desire as me to want to go back into their communities in which they come from. And it looks like, football camps, and it looks like back to school drives, and traditional philanthropy, because that's the playbook that was passed on to us. When you get to the NFL, you have an agent, you have a financial advisor, you set up your foundation, you do a couple, backpack giveaways, and you donate to your high school. Like, that's the model and that's the playbook, but it doesn't necessarily go into like economic development, right? We're not taught that. And I'm not no expert by any means. I'm learning every single day. But I do believe that if we were more knowledgeable about the ways in which we could go back into our community in a meaningful way, outside of just the philanthropic approach, I think that's where you start to see true progress. And I'm taking it upon myself to be an advocate, not just for, real estate development. Like there's so much more broader than that. Investing into entrepreneurs, starting businesses the right way. And, how can you leverage the capital and the influence, the social capital that you have as an athlete who comes from, a lot of the times these underserved communities? How can you leverage that? And so it's really the education that a lot of the times is missing, and we're not given the right playbook, so to speak.
That's really interesting. In my observation, I think a very similar dynamic is at play in the church. So the church actually is much more fluent in philanthropy or in giving, mission work in that traditional sense of taking money from one pot, giving it away in another pot, right? And doing sort of mission type work, whether it be locally or abroad or wherever. What the church is much less familiar with, I think, is this kind of more economic development in general, impact investing, using assets differently, right? Using property, using investment assets in a different way, rather than simply giving it away. And again, there's nothing wrong with the giving it away thing. The giving it away thing is good. We need the giving it away thing. There are certain needs in communities that can only be met by giving things away, not by generating, a business around it. But there's other needs sometimes that I think are more met through longer term investment, like what you're describing in your hometown, where you're making a longer term play in economic development as opposed to just giving something away. Todd, do you want to jump in on that? I mean, I don't know if this relates, but your phrase, sort of talking about what is good and how do you know it is coming up in my mind too, right? As it relates to this, what in this work, what is good and how do you know it? And does that vary depending on what sort of problems you're trying to tackle and what sort of resources you're trying to employ? Or if there's something else you want to say, that's fine. Jump in there too with that.
No, that's a great question. I think unpacking it takes a bit. But I listening to Derek speak, and having thought a lot about how we force people into a binary mode of either making a lot of money or giving money away to do good. That's a false premise to begin with, right? I mean, I think we can all agree, and probably everyone who's tuning in here says that can't be right. That's not the real world. That's this false dichotomy that we've created. And I've recently, over the last year, spent a lot of time with Ibram Kendi's thinking, been reading his books, I Can't Stop. And yesterday got to participate in a forum where he was speaking. And one of the things he said was, for people who haven't read it, let me first recommend How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's just a phenomenal story and a great read, and really shook me to the foundations of how to be a better ally on questions of racial disparity and inequity. But one of the things he said was, once you identify something like food scarcity, an area where, there's a food desert, let's say, people who are living in community and don't have access to good food. He said, food banks are great. And he didn't take anything away from the philanthropy that goes into creating food banks. But he said, foundationally, someone has to use their social capital to go and change the fundamentals of policy that have created the food desert in the first place. And I think whether we're talking about, issues of racism, or we're talking about issues of doing good in other ways, we have to grapple with the foundational question of policies and how are we going to deploy our capital, the social and financial capital that we have, in a way that's going to help to change policies. And I think, for me, this is informed from my faith. The things I tend to focus on are things that are going to either bring about some kind of personal transformation or some kind of change in policy around helping people and the planet to flourish. And that includes, looking at how to help companies that are on a mission to do good, not to forget that pursuing a mission to do good while killing your own employees is still a net bad. that there has to be an environment where you're thinking about all the stakeholders that are involved. You're creating a culture that allows employees to flourish, as well as allowing investors to flourish, as well as allowing beneficiaries and other stakeholders to flourish. And I think that started to get me 15 years ago away from this false dichotomy of it's either a 1 or a 0. You're either making money or you're helping people. And I think that false dichotomy is really, to use language of Ibram Kendi, I would Christian. It's unspiritual. It's by its very nature and complicity, supporting policies that are allowing injustices to be created on the money-making side that then get cleaned up with 5 or 10 or 15% leftover that people are using with philanthropy. And I think that's a challenge for the space.
I want to interject this idea of stewardship, if we could, into this. This is a really interesting idea. So I don't know if Reggie, if you want to unpack that a little bit more, because I think it relates very much to the conversation that we're having here.
Sure. And so as I was listening to Derek, and as Derek was sharing the values that guide his choices, his commitments, what was ringing in my mind and thoughts is really this whole notion of stewardship. It's about recognizing what we have has been entrusted to us. Now what's also been entrusted to us is choice. It's also been entrusted to us is authority. But stewardship is recognizing that we're not the owner. At least from a spiritual standpoint, it's recognizing we're not the owner. And so how do I manage faithfully what's been entrusted to me? And so as Derek talks about, thinking about, he's been blessed with privilege in various ways, blessed with financial resource. How does he best manage those resources and all that's been entrusted to him? And again, I lean into this whole notion of entrust. Somebody trusts you with resources that they own. And so for me, from my own Christian values, is recognizing that for whatever reason, God has chose to trust me with the resources that I have. And then I have to ask the question, how do I best manage and be faithful to the trust that's been offered to me? Combined with this whole notion of trust, of stewardship, is recognizing that, from a faith standpoint, that what I have has been entrusted to me by God. And so then part of my management of it also has to do with how do I understand and how do I relate to other people for whom I need to engage in managing what's been given to me. And I came across this quote that really has stuck with me, is that behind every economic theory, behind every economic practice or impact, there has to be an anthropology. So it's the issue of how do I understand my relationship with other human beings? Do I appreciate their sacred worth, no matter, again, using Derek's terms, no matter what their tax bracket is? Do I recognize and appreciate the sacred worth of all human beings, and how does that then inform my interaction? How does that inform my stewardship? How does that inform my sharing of the resources that I have, so that all have the potential to flourish within whatever sphere of influence that has also been entrusted to me?
Yeah. I mean, you're really getting at this core notion that as we go about our work with investment or just in relationship to money, that there has to be something driving behind that. What is, there has to be something deeper there, the meaning behind that underneath it, beyond just a transactional relationship with
Exactly.
money. Yeah. Yeah. Rosalie, did you want to add in here at all? Jump in with.
I was intrigued on a couple of levels there. A seminal moment for me in this journey was going to a whiteboard with Kevin before the very first SOCAP and having a conversation where we both were kind of getting our heads around where did relief money work? Where did philanthropy work? You know, when you had a problem, how was it fair to make money on different aspects of good? If you were developing an anti-malaria drug, was that something to invest in expecting a profit, or was that something to give your money away? And it, which is a really simple thing on one hand, but very complex on another, as we try to tease that apart. And then the other thing, Todd, when you were responding to Derek, in SOCAP 13 or 14, somewhere in there, we did a big focus on investing in health outcomes. And a partner who worked with us on that, physician Doug Judy, gave me an anecdote in some of the planning about that has stuck with me. But I'd never applied it to wealth disparity or food deserts or anything like that before until just this minute. But he was talking about how, imagine that there's a mountain that's got a twisty road coming down it, and people keep being in wrecks, and they invest in ambulances to get to the wreck and bring people back to the hospital that they've built. And what we really need to be investing in is guardrails. And, how do we keep these food deserts or other bottom of the pyramid issues from happening in the first place? And that's what I really think building the kingdom of God is about, is finding those ways to make sure that all of God's children can flourish on this planet and that the planet can flourish. So that's kind of my credo, is how do we engage with our money in a way, regardless of whether it's philanthropy or flat out investing for a big return. How do we engage with it in a way that we know as best we can that it's going to create that which God has called us to do?
So there's a question in the Q&A here. There's a few coming in, and feel free to add some more. One for Derek that relates to this, and this is a perhaps put you on the spot question a little bit. So one person asked, are you willing, Derek, to take on projects that are in some way below market rate if they have a higher impact? If so, why? And if not, why? I guess is what I would add to that. How does that calculus play, the calculus that Rosalie is talking about? How does that play out in your work?
I'm almost like losing sight of what market rate is, because the projects are like, market rate, I guess, what would you call it? 8-10%. I mean, like, market rate is variable, especially now. But like the project, I think you touched on it, like development is hard, but like making development projects work that have, social facilities or recreational facilities or low-income housing, like the capital that's needed and the creativity that's needed to make these projects, come to life, it has to be there. Because, let's just take what we're doing in Nashville, 105 units of mixed income housing. The housing is pretty much straightforward. We can go after some low-income housing tax credits, some some cheap debt, some equity, that works. But when we talk about a 50,000 square foot activity center, that's the most, in my opinion, most impactful component of the project. You got, a basketball court, recreational space, STEM programming, esports, healthy nutrition classes, all different types of programming. There's not a huge investor market for that. So it's like, that part of it is like, okay, we got to get creative. Like, can we go after philanthropy? Can we go, can we go after new market tax credits? Can we go after, the Tennessee Titans? Like, can they come into the equation? And, oh, by the way, the rental housing, yeah, it works, but you're maybe looking at a 5 or 6% return. So those things are like definitely a reality. I'm not saying that all impact projects don't, generate market or sometimes above market return, because, for example, like one of my projects, one of the companies that I'm invested in is Bitwise. And some of you guys may be familiar, they're out of Fresno. They do technology training in underserved markets. And they're raising $68 million, I think, right now on a Series B. And that investment is doing great. So that's just an example of like, hey, sometimes you don't always have to suffer in your returns, but I'm more in the real estate space now. So sometimes, a lot of the times, market rate just, sometimes you can achieve it, sometimes you can't, but you got to be comfortable with the full return and the full picture of like, maybe I'm at 5-6%, from an ROI perspective or IRR. But maybe like my return, like, on an intangible basis, maybe like all the jobs that are being created, that is tangible. You can measure that, or the education that's being attained, or the access to food, or whatever that metric is, that kind of shapes the full return of the project. And so it kind of balances each other out sometimes.
And to have clarity about what the point is too, right? I mean, so 10 years ago, we built a housing project here on the property that I oversee in Madison for about 250 students, $17 million project. And we had the same exact sort of questions you're describing. Do we put in lounges on every floor? Do we put in a big, large meeting space on the ground floor? No student housing in Madison has any of those amenities because that's all income producing space you're giving away. Enormous dollar amounts we had to give away to make those choices. But then we had to step back and say, why are we even building this thing? I mean, are we building this thing to serve our mission, which is to serve students, spiritual, emotional needs, or is it to maximize the return on the footprint of our property? And but it has to work too, right? I mean, so those questions were really tricky, difficult questions to wrestle with, because if it doesn't work, the whole thing falls apart and then your mission's dead in the water anyways. But if you're prioritizing return simply, or, just the financial aspects of it, then you're not really fulfilling the mission either. So there's no simple answer to it, I don't think, right? But it's worth wrestling with those questions.
Yeah.
Todd, you want to have any to add? You looked like you had something you wanted to say there or add in there.
I think one of the things we've discovered over time through IPAR is that, first of all, I come to the impact investing space with a firm belief that there's all kinds of capital being deployed that we should call impact investing. And it's some kind of a curve. There's alpha return capital, and there's money that's being given away. And there's lots of stuff in between. So to Kevin's question, there is concessionary capital out there that's going to try to have more impact and giving up something in the way of return. But the really interesting part is to try to figure out where the crossover points are. And as we've collected more data, one of the things we've come to realize is the kind of capital you deploy, as well as the geography you're focused on, the asset class you're in, the theory of change you're trying to have, and the intervention you're trying to have, are going to make a big difference in terms of what kinds of metrics you're going to measure and what kinds of outcomes you're going to be able to achieve. Now, to break that down a little bit, what we would say is, if you're investing with venture money, you're trying to have an internal rate of return that's very different than if you're investing in real estate. And you may make different decisions on what you would give up or change vis-a-vis impact, depending on those two types of investments. So we think there's 5 variables that make a drastic difference in terms of impact measurement, impact management, and ultimate net outcomes. And I mention that only because I think when we ask questions about, concessionary returns in favor of impact, part of that needs to be informed with a broader discussion about, well, what's the kind of impact we're trying to achieve? What's the theory of change that we have? What's the intervention that we're using? What kind of capital is it? And who are the ultimate stakeholders? And where are we trying to achieve it? Because those make big difference in that calculus of whether or not we need to use concessionary capital or can use alpha return capital, or maybe we have to use philanthropy to subsidize what we're doing. And the reason I'm so passionate about this is because, look, crossover points we would be able to free up more philanthropy, because my thesis is that there's a lot of philanthropy doing stuff where some of the private capital markets are starting to fill the gaps, but we don't have good information about where those crossover points are. And so we're, in some respects, wasting philanthropic dollars on things that the markets are starting to address, like real estate.
That's fascinating. I'm going to take a question here out of the Q&A that's a bit more extensive, so it needs to be read and shifts the direction a little bit, but I think it's interesting. And again, if you have other questions, please drop them in. So this person said, I feel like I'm writing to you from a rope bridge teetering above the chasm between liberal America and conservative America. So maybe this is a timely question. Maybe we don't want to touch it, but I guess we're going to go for it. I tend to move between the area of the investment world known as biblically responsible investing, which tends to be grounded on the conservative side. My experience with SOCAPers, including folks of faith, is definitely on the more liberal side. On the one hand, I'm glad to know that people of faith live on both sides of the chasm, even within the values-based investing world. So the question is, any thoughts on how we can close that gap? And this is a big thing facing our nation right now, isn't it? But what are the thoughts? Maybe not the whole nation, but maybe this world of impact investing, especially values-based. How do we close that gap? Listen to each other more. What do we do there with the different ways of doing that? And I'll just add, personally, I've had people ask me, what about sort of Christian impact investing? And then I often immediately say, what does that mean? What is Christian? What is Christian? I mean, how do you define that, right? So I think that's what this question is getting at. So do any of our panelists have thoughts on bridging those gaps that we have that have found themselves even in this space? Nobody wants to touch that one.
I would love to jump in, but I feel like I've been talking a lot.
I'd say go for it if you got something to say on that.
Todd, you're the guy. You're the one to answer the question.
Well, I think back to the foundational questions I ask. What is good and how do we know it? I think we've got to be prepared for the fact that even among people of faith, there are going to be different answers to that question. And I do think, from the Christian perspective, when we think about the body of the church, it is important that the body has all of its parts, and that we learn how to use them together. That at least is biblically taught as a truth. So, if we're going to do that, then I think we need to listen to the Green family, behind Hobby Lobby, who say, look, there's two things that are of eternal value. God's word and man's soul, and that's where we're going to deploy our capital. And we need to listen to people who say, yes, that's great, but how can you transform a soul and bring God's word to the young Ethiopian child who's starving to death? Are they going to be able to receive it? And I think it's a both and. I don't think it's a one or the other. I don't think there's a right and a wrong. What I'm really challenged to think about is, and I had this great conversation now over 10 years ago with a dear friend of mine. And in the course of the conversation, our political leanings became evident. And as part of it, one of us said, wow, I never believed that you could be a Christian and be a Democrat. And the other one said, wow, I never believed you could be a Christian and be a Republican. And we didn't give up our friendship and our care and love for one another just because of that, but we learned something about each other and about how to be a bridge dweller. You know, this is a phrase that I live into now. It's one thing to be comfortable in one land or the other. It's better to be comfortable in both lands, but I think our greatest aspiration should be loving to live on the bridge and inviting people from one land into the other land. And
That's good. Additional thoughts on that challenge, Reggie?
I feel I need to just lean in once again around the fact that, you know, whatever economic theory, practice, or impact that we're talking about has to be rooted in an anthropology. And in our theological arena, that would be called a theological anthropology. How do we understand humanity through the lens and through the eyes of God? And I guess my bias is that I think sometimes we take lightly how we value other human beings. We don't always see one another. And if we're able to see one another and really listen to one another, then I think our Christian values help us to better guide us in how we interact with one another. But it first requires us being able to see one another and hear one another. It also, you know, again, this is my bias, but I think that far too often we enter into even this whole theological anthropological conversation with a bent toward believing that God has a hierarchy. We may not say that, but I think that ends up being our behavior, that there's certain groups of folk that God favors more than others. And then that informs how we engage our interaction. And so I kind of just lean into what I truly believe it was the core tenet of Jesus. Love God, love neighbor. And let's wrestle with what does that mean?
Reggie, I have a question following up on that. I was always taught and lean into a lot that God did have a hierarchy and that the poor were on the top. And that's where I come across as a liberal, I think, because that's where I lean into this, the poor are on the top of the hierarchy. Now, I don't live it all the time, but it's what I want to believe. And then as you were talking, I was thinking about it, that one of the things that really has formed me is being an Episcopalian, a line in our baptismal covenant that we repeat with, some would say, monotonous regularity in the Episcopal Church, that we vow to respect the dignity of every human being and to seek and serve Christ in all people. And it doesn't say just the poor. That doesn't list a hierarchy. It says every human being. And that just started coming back to me over and over. And it is really difficult for all of us across this country, on whatever end of the spectrum we are seeing it played out right now, and just with horrific consequences.
Yeah, you know, one of the challenges I'm coming to realize is that the English language is complex. And so part of our leaning in and listening to one another, and particularly as we think about these divides between liberal and conservative, is that we might be saying the same thing but using different words, and so we miss one another. And so, you know, when I talk about not having a hierarchy, God not having a hierarchy, I'm more talking about humanity itself, that all humanity has value and worth. I do think that there is a preference toward the poor, because that's more about social location. That's more about where folk find themselves. And so thinking about Paul's admonishment to the Corinthians, you know, when I come, you know, can you provide for the work that we're trying to do in Macedonia, because they're catching it, they're struggling, and this, that, and the other. And so Corinthians, you have more resources that can be of greater support and help to the work that's going on in Macedonia. And let me show you your brothers and sisters in Antioch. They're struggling too, but they're giving out of the best that they have, because they're recognizing the challenges that are out there, and God is still blessing. And so Corinthian church, you need to be doing the same thing. And so I think that there is a preference about recognizing those who may find themselves outside, who may not have the same level of, who are not able to engage in the same level of flourishing as others. The responsibility then is for those who are doing better than some others. Our responsibilities is to help others flourish.
I've heard you talk before, Reggie, about language being a difficult, you know, barrier, and I think that's true. That's a good example of raising that here. I do want to make sure people have an opportunity to ask questions if there's additional questions. We've had a number of interesting sort of comments and chats in the chat that are great. If folks haven't seen that, I encourage you to look through that. You know, one of the little directions that went in the chat was around the church specifically getting involved in impact investing. Actually, you know, the way I want to touch on that maybe here real quick is ask Derek, would you ever invest, or have you ever invested in a church project, like a church-owned project or a church-led project?
Yeah, we have two currently in the works right now, both in the Atlanta area. One that's out near the airport, one in Austell, Georgia. But the one in Austell is one of my former pastors when I was living in Atlanta. You know, the one thing about churches historically is there are large landholders, and you know, they have these large buildings that are, you know, quite frankly, they're only really in service 1-2 days out the week. That model, as I'm sure a lot of you on the call, is dying, and there needs to be more of an innovative approach and a more comprehensive and encompassing approach to what the church actually looks like, the actual physical, you know, building of a church. What does that even mean? And so the one pastor that we've been dealing with, he's a younger guy. He's probably early 30s, has a very forward-thinking mindset on like how to reinvent what the church is. And so they have 30 acres, and we're talking about doing low-income housing, really mixed income housing, as well as amenities for the residents, whether that's education, whether that's workforce development, daycare, all the different essential services that are needed in that community. But like I really feel like it's an untapped, you know, resource. You know, you have all this land and these old buildings, and there's so much potential there, right? And so if you have a partner that's willing and wanting to move at an expedient cadence, there's a high possibility of forming a mutually beneficial partnership. And so, you know, I don't shy away from churches. You know, there's a stigma where, you know, whether you're working with governments or churches, like there's this, you know, it could be a little bit longer, a little bit more difficult. There's more politics. But even from some of the elders that we've been dealing with, like they're all on board with the mission. So it streamlines things. And so I really feel like that's something that kind of God is leading us into doing, is working with these churches and helping them to repurpose some of their land.
That's great.
Yeah,
I think we're
Derek,
going to start. No, go ahead, Rosa.
That's something that we're really paying a lot of attention to at Faith and Finance. Is we've been calling it assets in transition. You know, what's happening to, we heard a story at SOCAP last year. I'm not sure I've got the numbers exactly right, but it was of this magnitude that I think it was an AME church had sold their property for $350,000, and the developer they sold it to flipped it for $3 million 2 months later. And, you know, how do we help congregations understand that as the model of the church changes, that that there's still assets there to be deployed for the kingdom? You know, how do we start having those kinds of conversations, and that selling your property may not be the only thing. It may be that God's calling you to run a low-income housing project, or who knows.
Yeah. Well, I think we want to start heading towards wrapping up here. But I want to give all the panelists one more voice, one more word. If you've got a word you want to leave people with on this subject. If people are heading into SOCAP next week, or not, but hopefully some folks are, you know, what is it that you might encourage them to think about as they head into all these millions of sessions that SOCAP is offering with regard to this question of bringing faith into the conversation? I might start with Todd on this one, just because, as I understand it, Todd, you've gone to all the SOCAPs in the past. So you probably have a good sense of what SOCAP is all about. But if everyone wants to just say a sentence, you know, a couple sentences, that'd be a great way to wrap up.
Yeah, well, thanks. It's true. I have been to all the SOCAPs. I was even the first person to register for many of them. I've been really grateful for the opportunity to participate with SOCAP, where we helped to sponsor the first couple of SOCAPs. Yeah, I think for people going to SOCAP, you know, the thing that's taken me time over a lot of SOCAPs is to not be fearful of talking about what is good and why, how I know it. Everyone's going to have a different reference point at SOCAP, but I find that many people are informed by their faith belief or belief system, whether it's Christian or it's Muslim or it's Judaism or it's some of the Far Eastern religions. I think, you know, there's a great deal of commonality. Things like the Golden Rule weren't invented by Jesus. And it's actually, I find it, as I've been able to come out of my shell more over time at SOCAP, I find it really affirming to talk to people, other people of faith, and to talk to people who don't have a faith belief system, but to introduce faith into the conversation, not for the purpose of changing their minds, but just for the purpose of me learning better how to be a bridge dweller.
Reggie, Derek, Rosalie, any words of wisdom?
I think, as you were talking, Todd, I was thinking about SOCAP 08, which was the first one, and our remembering a few days ago together about for those of you who haven't been to SOCAP since the beginning, probably the first 5 years, on the last day we had an open space technology set of sessions, and that people created their own agenda, and we always made sure to have a session on faith and spirituality there. And it was always shocking to me that a third of the people who were, 10% of the people who were on campus that last day, at least 10% of them showed up for that session on spirituality. So I think as you're in these conversations, to not be, not think you're alone, that there are people of faith who are operating out of that lens, that set of values, having those conversations. And then the other thing is try to, I think that the SOCAP virtual is going to give people, a lot more people, a lot of different opportunities to interact and to not be shy to do that, to interact with the folks around you and to find ways to create the conversations that you want to have at SOCAP this year. And it's trying to be an event producer in these days, I will say that. And but they are working really hard at putting together a fantastic event. And like you said, it's got 1 million sessions.
So last year was my very first year attending SOCAP. And on the one hand, it was overwhelming because it's all new language to me. But this is where I also then lean into how we define things. What I came to understand is that what is considered impact investing, social impact, social entrepreneurial work, is what the church has been doing for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And we just use different language. We call it community outreach, community engagement, benevolence. We just use different language. And so SOCAP was an opportunity for me to learn the language of another culture, of another world. And so I would want to encourage particularly persons of faith, persons who are actively involved in faith communities, to take the time to learn this, what would be a new culture for them. Because what I also realized in interacting with several of the folk at SOCAP was that we had common commitments and common desires that we wanted to try to achieve. And what I found fascinating when they found out that I was active in the world of theology, and I think I didn't get to mention that I'm also a pastor. They got to know that I was involved in that work as well. These are folk who, are managing resources related to philanthropy, impact investing, and all of that. And they're saying, I heard that working with churches and faith communities would be great to be able to work with folk who are actually on the ground doing the work, but I don't know that community. And so there's a great opportunity to be that bridge dweller that Todd's been talking about, between those who have resources and are trying to find ways to channel resources to those who are actually doing the work on the ground, and recognizing that faith communities are one of those groups that are doing that work. And so it's my hope and my desire, particularly through the nonprofit that I formed, to be able to create this ecosystem that allows us to be able to make that kind of bridging that we desire to make.
Mark, could you restate the question? I want to make sure I'm talking accurately.
Yeah, I think it's really just as thinking about heading into SOCAP, which begins in the next few days, what kind of words of wisdom might you give people, especially people coming at it with a faith-based lens, as far as engaging with that content, engaging with the experience? Obviously, we don't really know exactly how it's going to feel online, but in general, yeah.
Got you. Yeah. So like Reggie, my first year was last year. I can't even believe it's been a year already. But it was like very overwhelming, just kind of looking around. But, when you kind of got a little bit more, comfortable and more acclimated to the environment, it's really astonishing. Just the caliber of people that are in the room, or it won't be that way this year, but that are a part of the conference. And, whoever you talk to, it seemed like there was some type of synergy there. And I met a lot of good people from that conference that I still talk to this day, really. Mark, you being one of them. And so I really believe that, you know, there are a lot of, you know, I'm sure there's more this year, programming opportunities. But I would say, you know, just kind of look at, you know, how I look at things like this is looking at, okay, what do I gravitate towards? What resonates with me from a programming standpoint, and who would I like to potentially meet, right? And understand, like, okay, maybe they're beneficial to, you know, my trajectory. And so understanding the relationship component, which I gotta admit, like, it's got to be tough in this environment from a digital standpoint, but I'm sure there will be opportunities to sync up with, you know, with people and have connection points. So really just understanding like what resonates, you know, for you, and understanding different participants or speakers that may be really beneficial for you to meet.
That's great. Thank you, Derek. Well, speaking of relationship, I'm really grateful for the panelists to take the time and for us to have relationship, even if it's mediated through the screen here. It's still been really fruitful. I've really enjoyed the last hour together, as well as our conversations prior to this. You've made the case for people of faith enriching the SOCAP experience really well. So I think one takeaway is, don't be afraid to bring that into the conversation, because those questions of faith and of values are really vital to all conversations around money and investing. So let's make sure we bring those into the conversation. Thanks to everyone who attended and we're on here. And I guess I'll leave it with Rosalie to close us out.
Thank you, Mark, for doing this, and thank you, Todd and Reggie and Derek, for your words about how SOCAP has been a part of what you're doing, and more important, what you're doing in your lives to bring about God's kingdom. I'm inspired by all of this. Want to just tell everybody that the next event that Faith and Finance is going to have is going to be November 17th and 18th at Neighborhood Economics, Healing Our Communities. And it's really going to be about putting the ideas that we talked about here into practice in our neighborhoods, and hope that each one of you will be able to join us. And I'm sure that Rachel has put a link to that somewhere in the chat function. Our number one keynoter, or I guess our two number one keynoters, are Peter Block, who helped us start the work of neighborhood economics in Cincinnati, and then Willie James Jennings, who is a theologian who's speaking to this idea of stewardship and possession and land, and how it all fits together, and how do we operate in the built environment as people of faith. And so we're really looking forward to that event, and hope you'll all join us. Thank you for joining us today.